Okay, my link is here, waiting for people to join. I'm going to go post this in my page here. Hi. Sharing this with everybody. Let's put this here and here. Okay. I love doing live readings. It's been a little while since I've done one, but this is a good thing to do. I'm going to be reading today out of Dissonance Volume I Reality, which is the first installment in the trilogy of Dissonance. I then went back and wrote a prequel, but Dissonance Volume I Reality is the one that has been adapted for the screen and is now being pitched to streaming networks. So yay, very, very excited. So here is, if you haven't seen these already, let's go ahead and turn this off. Close Outlook because that's going to just beep us. If you haven't seen these already, this is my the first one that I penned in the series. This is Dissonance Volume I Reality. Look at this beautiful cover. Okay, gorgeous. That is a character from the book. I won't tell you which one because I like to let you figure that out on your own. This is the sequel, Dissonance Volume II Reckoning. That one follows up 10 days after the end of the events in book one. Here is Dissonance Volume 3 Renegade, and this completed the trilogy. I love these covers. Her name is Cyan. I cannot pronounce her last name, but if you message me afterwards, I'll send you her name and tag her. She's amazing, and she redesigned all these covers. I love them. Then I went back and I wrote the prequel for the trilogy called Dissonance Volume 0 Revelation. The events happen in 2026 and then conclude in 2042, 16 years after the alien invasion that wipes out 85% of humanity. So it's actually pretty scary. The Gorgons are no joke. So I'm going to start reading here. And if you have any comments, feel free and post them there. But this is the excerpt. And tell me in the chat if you cannot hear anything. But I'm going to go ahead and start. So it picks up with Sergeant Cameron Jet is his nickname. Cameron Jet Shipley and his brother Ruddy, Wyatt Ruddy Shipley, returning to the blockade after being handed an amulet, a device that they're not sure what its purpose is, what it's going to do for them, and they return it to the captain of their blockade. Jet returns to his bunk in the blockade and is then reflecting on what has happened over the past 16 years. So he's kind of going through the whole reminiscing, missing family, so on and so forth, wondering about the amulet, so on and so forth. So here is the excerpt of Jet reflecting on what has happened. I remember when the Gorgons first arrived in 2026. Admittedly, we were all enthralled. I was too. Sis was especially enthralled. Somebody in Guatemala spotted the first one, if I remember correctly. It just came drifting down straight out of the sky near sunset, so humanoid and yet enshrouded in mist. They had angelic qualities to them. Some of us wondered if they were messengers from God. Their bodies were cloaked in that bluish-green vapor. It was really creepy, but for whatever reason, it's the creepy things that draw us in the most. We just can't look away, like a moth to a flame. Then there was another, and 5 more, and then 20 more, 50, 400. More kept coming, just slowing down to a geostationary orbit 50 feet above the ground all over the earth. The dogs were perpetually screaming and howling. Some of their ears were reportedly even bleeding. They were running mad, whining and cowering in terror, fleeing to dark corners with their tails between their legs. I was only 7 then. Ruddy was just 3. Sissy was 6. But I remember it all. In the 16 years since then, they laid waste to pretty much everything, except the blockades, of course. Oh, they knew where we all were, and they didn't like it when we ventured out for any reason. They got especially hot if they saw any of us heading in any direction that even remotely resembled going toward a coastline. No matter the continent, they wanted us pigeonholed far inland. We could never figure out why. Some straggled around by day still, but all we knew concretely was that they mostly reappeared every evening near dusk. Where they all largely disappeared to during the day, no one ever really knew. Apparently, they didn't like sunlight, and they would almost entirely vanish for a month on end during the summertime when it got into the high 80s and 90s. Those were our reprieves. It was times like that that we actually praised all the ozoners that went before us, inconsiderate humans with their carbon emissions, fossil fuels, aerosols, and CFCs. They didn't know it, but they were actually helping us, warming up the planet, making the atmosphere hotter and hotter, more inhospitable to not just us, but them as well. I heard recently that a team of guys actually wrangled a gorgon in the heat of summer while wearing some kind of protective eye shields, and they stripped it down. It just flailed, writhed, and screamed as it baked in the hot summer sun, sizzled and smoked even. Apparently, they had some vampiric traits too. Never found out any more about it because you can't trust all stories, and I, for one, don't plan to wrangle any gorgon to see if it tries to suck blood too. I remember the first time I saw one for myself. Back then, they weren't really evil to behold. They just had this sort of ethereal quality to them, angelic almost, and they just sat there and hummed, floated. We tried to make contact with them, of course, but they never moved. For 3 months, they just stayed there as more and more of them slowly floated down, taking up positions. We were all so uneasy. What the hell were they? Why were they here? Where did they come from? What did they want? All those questions piling up stunk more than the mound, frankly. But then we got our answers, sure enough. Whether through some kind of telepathy or some primitive form of timing, they all began to move. One by one, they clicked on like a countdown had finished or a switch had been flipped. And that's when they started hunting us down. Nothing we did mattered. Hiding was of little use. Shooting at them only made them move angrier, and they'd get faster. And that high-pitched shriek and dropped jaw thing. Lord. I remember a man kept shooting and shooting at one perched on the corner of a pretty tall building. I think he had a sniper rifle. But with each shot, the Gorgon hurtled downward faster and faster until both it and the man disappeared in a thunderous cataclysm of concrete and dust. The Gorgon was the only one that came out of that pit, a little fatter than it had been before it smashed down. There were thousands of them in the air, swooping in all directions. Airplanes were overwhelmed and thrown out of the sky. It was pandemonium to the power of frenzy, to the power of chaos. The earth was upended that day, and in the days following. The military had no time to mobilize. These things were everywhere. And those poor souls who had to man helicopter gunships, they didn't stand a chance. And then the news once reported that a swarm of them passed, mind you, an F-35 jet on patrol. Frozen pilots plunged into the sea, the ground, the history books. All our hopes went up in blazes of glory. There were so many jets and commercial airliners at the bottom of the ocean now. Each nation responded in whatever way they felt they should. There was no consensus in the United Nations because there was never time or safety in order to mobilize a gathering, and many world leaders were already filling the bellies of the Gorgons anyway. North Korea shot missiles in vain. Thankfully, their nukes were intercepted before they killed us all while trying to mount a meager but impotent counterattack. Iran was the same. The saddest part of it was the Gaza war just a few years prior. The Israelis and Palestinians had never quite afforded each other full truce. They would throw one another at a Gorgon if it meant they would escape with their lives. Traps were set by one side or the other to lure in Gorgons and devour whole households of their enemies. Despicable. Same with Ukraine and Russia. People desperate to sabotage their fellow humans just to get a few paces ahead. But the Gorgons were faster than all of us. The subject of nukes was never off the table. There was just no one who could get them mobilized. And where were they even supposed to detonate one? The chances of the entire human race getting wiped out by friendly fire were all too high. Everyone, everywhere, was impacted. Every nation had thousands of them flying around. Those that could shelter in place could find out a little bit here and there on the news, but eventually there was no central news and nothing to find out what was happening at other outposts. No CNN, no MSNBC, no news sites. I mean, they were there, but none of them were updated. VPNs hosted phantom sites that were frozen in time years back with no updated content. Their content and IT departments had been eaten. The Gorgons just caught, froze, and ate us one by one. rinse and repeat in a grisly shower of cataclysm. In a few years, 85% of the world's population was gone. The survivors lingered where they could, flitting from place to place, eking out a life of survival amidst the shadows. Since that time, the earth became a ghost town, abandoned, with overgrown ivy and out-of-control moss, mildew and weeds, vehicles everywhere, abandoned in mid-transit, crashed airplanes, trains off their tracks. Animals roamed the streets freely after a while, escaping their enclosures. Most were picked off right there in their zoos. Even the king of the jungle was eviscerated by a single gorgon. Cheetahs couldn't outrun them. Sure, automated systems still ran, sprinklers, night lights, AC systems, and so on. We still had power and utilities, just no humans to routinely man them. So eventually, several systems failed. Fuel rods in some nuclear reactors, unattended to by human intervention, heated out of control. In some countries, they failed, and the prevailing winds from radiation killed off many of the survivors over time as well. At least the radiation got some gorgons with that too, though. Electricity went out over whole swaths of the earth for some survivors. Then hypothermia and disease did the rest. We figured the gorgons killed off 80% of us almost straight away. Then the ensuing natural calamities got another roughly 5% after that. Someone was still creeping around and running things where and when they could. Independent heroes or troops ventured bravely into dangerous territory to keep things running or to jumpstart failed hydroelectric, solar systems, or power plants. Clandestine operations were springing up all the time all over the globe, desperate to keep us running. Those with nursing or doctoral backgrounds stemmed the tide somewhat, but they had to learn fast. We weren't lacking in medical supplies as long as we could conduct a raid on a hospital or clinic. It was just ramping up quick education to those who could actually wield them. But for the most part, it was like trying to pour a cup of cold water on a raging inferno. Eventually, we would lose. Earth became unoccupied and barren, a desolate wasteland of lifeless quiet and a graveyard of ominous vacancy, except for them. Once a gorgon had you in their sights, you just froze. Initially, it seemed it was just out of primal fear or terror. But no, there was actually something emanating from them that paralyzed the viewer. We thought it might be some kind of chemical agent, energy transference, or something like that seemed to be taking place. We had scientists working on it. That's why we called them gorgons, the power they had to literally stick you to the ground right where you were, and you couldn't move. And then they would float over and have their way with you, all the while whispering with that spine-chilling hiss, the sound of countless breaths of voices mingled together in wordless agony. I don't know which is worse, knowing that you can't run or being eaten alive while you can't even scream. I remember the little girl, though. She was about my age, and I could tell she was crying while the gorgon ate her. She definitely felt it, all of it. Sometimes they wouldn't even need to paralyze you. They'd simply catch up with you, whisking behind you as you fled for your life, like me today just before the blockade. They were just fast. Some people closed their eyes as they fought back once we learned of their paralysis method. But that was pretty futile. You were just shadowboxing, swinging at nothing. One way or another, they would get you, and the best you could do was just to hide and ride it out and, for God's sake, be quiet. One of them was just as bad as a swarm of them. The most unnerving thing, you just don't think of humans as a food source. We have memories, souls, history, purpose. We aren't just some wild gazelle or antelope out in the Serengeti. We aren't just some prey. When you eat a human, you destroy purpose, memories, sanctity, and life. It was an abominable act. But of course, gorgons don't know any of that. They're just predators like any other shark or cheetah or hyena. A gorgon was no respecter of persons. I shivered and turned over, pulling a thin, ratty blanket up over me. It felt like a scratchy Brillo pad, but it was something, at least. You know that point where your body craves sleep, and you know that you need it, but your eyes just won't stay closed? Yeah, that's where I was. For 16 long years, we had lived under the shadow of these things, wishing to high heaven that they'd just go, and hoping to hell that they wouldn't find us out in the wild out here. Our world had been forever changed. My life had been forever changed. I was one of the lucky ones who happened to be born at the right time in history so as to witness all of this, to live it out, and to have to accept it as just how life was. The ones who came after me, and there weren't many because why would you? would never know what it was like to see them all drift down out of the sky, to hear them all suddenly start to move into action as if a switch had been flipped. It was the switch that was labeled annihilation of man. To actually watch one of them eating one of us whole, to hear that bone-chilling, slimy hiss. You don't ever forget that sound. These babies were lucky enough to be born inside the blockade and to be kept far in near the center, away from the threat that for them lingered only on the edge of legends and myth. But if they could sleep in peace because of our tireless labor, fine with me. Ignorance is truly bliss. However, it wasn't a myth for me. Losing my family wasn't a myth. That cat today wasn't a myth. The amulet wasn't a myth. The amulet. Even now, I wondered what they were doing with it. But more so, I wondered what it would do for us. What would Stony do with it? What were the rest of them? Where were the rest of them? What would the beast reveal? It was unearthly, to be sure, and they had found a few of them before, but only recently had scientists discovered that they arrived at the same time the Gorgons did. There had to be some kind of tie-in. At least that's what we all seem to now be pinning our hopes to. With these and a million more questions pouring through my mind, somehow I was able to fall asleep, though I don't know when, as it was pretty fitful. The room hummed with an unearthly rigor, the sound of countless engines throbbing throughout the blockade. I was uneasy. There was no way we were going to make it. That was our reality. That is the excerpt and from Dissonance Volume I Reality. And oh, look at this. A little bookmark that I can use that is shamelessly emblazoned with my website. Look at that. Goes good with my book. Anyway, Dissonance Volume I Reality is the one that has been adapted to screen and is now being pitched to streaming networks. Check it out at dissonancetheseries.com, or you can look me up at on Amazon at just look for Dissonance Aaron Ryan. You'll find the whole series. There's an omnibus edition that includes all 4 of the books. And surprise, surprise, I did show you these books. These are the 4 in the trilogy, or in the quadrilogy, rather. What I ended up doing is I'm writing a 5th. So it is another prequel, and it is going to go between, I think I have them totally out of order here. So they go like this. Bear with me for a moment. It's going to go right here. So it'll actually be effectively book 2. But the way these are titled, you'll understand that is a double entendre in the title and the subtitle that you'll find throughout the book. I'm thrilled to be in the Dissonance universe and writing another installment. I can't wait to share it. It's going to be slated probably for end of September, early October release. But that's the excerpt from Dissonance Volume I Reality, and I'll be back to share some more another time. Thank you for tuning in or for enjoying it after the fact. And check out dissonancetheseries.com. Take care.